There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened.
The Chernobyl disaster left behind scenes so disturbing that the Soviet Union fought to keep them out of sight. These are the images that showed the truth.
A massive blob of radioactive material sits under the plant, so deadly that just standing near it for a minute could kill.
Radiation tearing through bodies, poisoning towns, mutating animals, and destroying entire communities. Behind the controlled statements and staged reports are terrifying photos that captured the real cost of the explosion. The first photo ever taken of the reactor after the explosion. This photo was taken on April 27, 1986, around 4 p.m., only 14 hours after the reactor exploded. He was inside a helicopter flying about 200 meters above the destroyed core. The picture looks foggy because the radiation was so strong it damaged the film the moment the camera shutter opened. The air around the helicopter measured about 1,500 rem, a dose high enough to kill a person in minutes. The helicopter's meters could not even read the real radiation level because they maxed out long before reaching it. Kostin had to stay back from the open door to avoid absorbing a fatal dose, which is why the photo is taken from a distance and at an angle. Even being in the helicopter put everyone on board in danger. This image was forbidden because it showed exactly how bad the situation really was. The reactor was not just damaged, it was completely exposed, with the core open to the environment. The Soviet government was still claiming the accident was small and under control. This single photo proved the opposite. It revealed that the explosion was massive, the radiation was extreme, and the authorities had misled both the Soviet people and the rest of the world. The government hid this photo because it would have exposed their failure to contain the disaster and their refusal to warn civilians who were already being exposed to dangerous radiation. The mutated newborn pig. Radiation had been in the farms around Chernobyl for years by the time this newborn piglet appeared in 1989. The piglet was born with a deformed body and limbs bent at unnatural angles. Radiation from Chernobyl had entered the soil, the feed, and the water, damaging DNA in the livestock that remained on contaminated farms. Cases like this did not appear once. They appeared repeatedly, years after the explosion. Farmers reported calves, foals, birds, and pigs with severe deformities, all showing signs of radiation damage passed from one generation to the next. The mutation in this piglet made clear that the contamination had moved deeper into the ecosystem, embedding itself into the reproductive cycle of the animals that lived there. This photograph exposed a truth the Soviet Union did not want to acknowledge. The fallout was still poisoning everything alive, and the damage was spreading silently through each new generation born on the ruined land. The firefighter. This firefighter was among the first men ordered onto the roof of Reactor 4, a place soaked in deadly radiation within minutes of the explosion. He went in thinking it was an ordinary fire. By the time he reached hospital number 6, the effects of that exposure were already tearing through his body. His face had been wrapped in heavy layers of gauze because the skin beneath had started to peel away. These were not surface burns. They were the signature injuries of Chernobyl, radiation killing tissue from the inside outward, leaving doctors with almost nothing they could treat. Metal spacers had been fitted around his fingers to prevent what remained of his skin from tearing or sticking. Even small movements could have caused the burned, failing tissue to split open. He had been placed in isolation because his body itself carried enough contamination to put others at risk. Many firefighters from Chernobyl had arrived in similar condition, walking on their own, unaware that the exposure they had taken on the roof had already set off unstoppable internal damage. Within hours, they suffered vomiting, bleeding, and skin separation. Within days, most were terminal. This photograph contradicted every claim that the Chernobyl fire was contained or minor. It showed what the reactor had truly done to the men who stood closest to it. Young firefighters who went in without warnings, without protection, and paid for it with injuries so severe the state refused to let the public see them. Bloated, radiation-killed fish. In the hours after the Chernobyl explosion, something went horribly wrong in the plant's cooling lake. Large fish began surfacing in massive numbers, their bodies swollen, soft, and lifeless. These fish had absorbed lethal doses of radiation within hours of the explosion. Their bodies had bloated and softened, a clear sign of internal tissue breakdown caused not by disease or pollution, but by direct radioactive exposure. They floated to the surface in large numbers, dying so quickly that workers could lift them straight out of the water by hand. The lake had originally been part of the reactor's cooling system, designed to regulate the plant's turbines. After the explosion, it became a high radiation trap, pulling contaminated water and debris directly into the ecosystem. Anything that entered it, fish, insects, birds, died almost immediately. Kostan's photo captured this collapse in real time, showing how fast the fallout had poisoned every living thing near the reactor. This image contradicted every official attempt to claim the contamination was limited or under control. The fish made the truth impossible to hide. Chernobyl had destroyed local wildlife instantly, and the radiation was powerful enough to kill entire species in a single day. The mutated colt. 2 years after Chernobyl, animals were still being born broken. On a contaminated farm in Ukraine, a colt emerged with legs so deformed that it could not stand or survive. Its deformities were the result of radiation-damaged DNA, the same genetic impact seen in birds, cows, pigs, insects, and other livestock throughout the Chernobyl region. This colt became one of the clearest examples of what long-term fallout exposure was doing to animals born on contaminated farms. The mutations were so extreme that scientists produced a life-size image of the colt and sent it directly to Mikhail Gorbachev in an attempt to force the government to acknowledge the severity of the problem. The message was impossible to misinterpret. Chernobyl was still altering the biology of every species living in the zone. This photograph exposed a truth Soviet officials refused to make public. The fallout was not just in the soil, it was reshaping living creatures from birth. It proved that the environmental damage was ongoing, widespread, and far more devastating than the state had admitted. Pripyat mass evacuation. This photograph, taken on April 27, 1986, showed Pripyat residents boarding buses and trucks less than 36 hours after the explosion. No one wore gas masks because officials insisted there was no serious danger and that the situation at the plant was under control. People were told to bring only documents and a few personal items because the evacuation would be temporary. Pets and livestock were left behind, locked in homes and yards. The government's original message to the public was simple. A small fire had occurred, everything was contained, and there was no threat to civilians. But this image showed the opposite, an entire city being cleared out in a single day. More than 49,000 people were removed immediately, followed by tens of thousands more from surrounding towns, as radiation readings climbed far beyond what officials had admitted. This photograph made clear that Chernobyl was not a controlled emergency. It was a catastrophic release of radiation so severe that the Soviet Union had no choice but to quietly evacuate an entire population while still publicly insisting nothing major had happened. Villages bulldozed and buried. In this scene, a bulldozer pushed a house toward a deep trench dug to bury an entire structure. Cleanup crews had gone through the villages marking buildings with large painted X's, identifying anything that could not be decontaminated. Once marked, the homes were crushed and shoved into pits. Schools, barns, farmhouses, and full blocks of streets followed, erased in a matter of hours. These towns were not simply abandoned. They were intentionally buried because the radiation had sunk into every part of the environment. The wood, soil, roofing, and foundations had absorbed contamination so deeply that no cleaning method could make them safe again. In many places, workers covered the pits with concrete to trap the radioactive debris. Room 3052. A new photo taken deep inside Chernobyl exposes one of the most dangerous areas still left in the reactor ruins. It showed part of Room 3052, an underground chamber buried under collapsed concrete and metal. The picture looks like an abandoned storage space, but it reveals something far more alarming. The nuclear fuel trapped inside that room has started to react again. When Reactor 4 exploded in 1986, the fuel melted and mixed with sand, steel, and reactor materials. It formed solid masses called fuel-containing materials that spread through the lower levels like hardened lava. These materials remain extremely radioactive, and Room 305/2 contains some of the largest concentrations. They sit under unstable rubble that has not been moved in decades. Over the last few years, sensors in the room have detected a steady rise in neutron activity. This is not a harmless fluctuation. It means the nuclear fuel is slowly beginning to fission again. The reaction is building quietly, out of sight, in a sealed space where no one can intervene without exposing workers to deadly radiation. Pripyat's abandoned school hall. Before the explosion, this gymnasium was filled every week with the sound of children running, shouting, and playing. It belonged to school number 3 in Pripyat, built for the families of Chernobyl plant workers. Now, the room is silent and collapsing. The wooden floor is cracked open, warped, and covered in dust, broken glass, and rotting debris. Basketball hoops still hang at each end, but they look crooked and ready to fall. Old sports equipment lies scattered across the floor, including deflated balls, tangled ropes, and crushed hoops. In the photo, part of the ceiling has collapsed, leaving a jagged opening that lets in a cold, gray light. The brightness does not make the room feel safer. It only exposes the damage. The walls, once painted green, are now streaked with water stains and mold. Rusted lockers lean to one side, while broken boards and fallen panels create a maze of hazards across the floor. Although decades have passed, the gym is still dangerous. The dust inside contains radioactive particles that cling to surfaces and rise into the air when disturbed. Radon levels remain high enough to pose a serious health risk. Anyone who walks inside breathes contamination with every step. Red Forest. One of the most forbidden and disturbing photos from the Chernobyl exclusion zone shows a section of the Red Forest, the most radioactive patch of land near the power plant. The image captures scorched earth, blackened tree trunks, and pine needles frozen in an unnatural orange color. These trees were killed twice. The first death came in 1986 when they absorbed a lethal dose of radiation within hours of the reactor explosion. The second came 30 years later, when a massive wildfire swept through the area in 2016 and burned most of what remained. The Red Forest covers about 2 to 3 square miles. It earned its name because the radiation changed the pine needles from green to a bright red-orange before they died. Soviet officials buried many of the dead trees in trenches, but large sections were left in place, too dangerous to touch. The forest never returned to its original state. Instead, small patches of new growth appeared over the years, mostly deciduous trees which handle radiation better than pines. The 2016 wildfire erased much of that slow progress. It burned roughly 80% of the forest and released radioactive particles back into the air. The photo taken afterward shows a landscape stripped of life. The soil is damaged. Scientific teams who entered the area reported alarmingly low biological activity. Even organisms responsible for breaking down organic matter, such as earthworms, have nearly disappeared. Radiation readings taken from test plots showed exposure levels from 15 micrograys per hour to more than 600. Those numbers explain why the Red Forest became one of the most restricted locations in the entire zone, and why Soviet authorities never wanted the world to see what their disaster had truly created. The Chernobyl necklace. After Chernobyl, thousands of children carried the disaster on their bodies. A thin, horizontal scar stretched across the throat became a common sight. Surgeons made the incision to remove damaged thyroid glands after radioactive iodine flooded their bodies in the weeks following the 1986 explosion. The mark never faded. It became known as the Chernobyl necklace, a permanent reminder of radiation exposure and one of the most visible signs of the disaster's long-term human cost. Thyroid cancer cases surged among children in Ukraine, Belarus, and nearby regions. Many families had no idea their children were drinking contaminated milk or eating crops filled with radioactive iodine. The thyroid absorbs iodine quickly, especially in children, which made the radioactive form extremely dangerous. As the cancer spread, thousands of young patients ended up in operating rooms, and each surgery left the same unmistakable mark. Belarus reported some of the highest numbers because its farmland and water supplies received some of the heaviest fallout. Entire communities carried the risk inside their bodies without realizing it. The elephant's foot. This image captures a man in a hard hat standing near a huge, cracked mass that looks like dried lava. That object is the elephant's foot, and it is one of the most dangerous concentrations of radiation ever created by humans. The photo is terrifying because it shows a person standing next to material that could kill someone in minutes. The elephant's foot formed in the days immediately after the 1986 explosion. The nuclear fuel inside the reactor melted completely, mixed with sand, steel, insulation, and concrete, and flowed like molten metal through the building. It burned through floors and pipes, finally settling in a chamber below the reactor. What remained was a solid mass of radioactive corium so powerful that early readings were off the charts. At the time, standing next to it for even 60 seconds meant lethal radiation exposure. A person would begin to vomit within hours and die soon after. Even a decade later, the radiation was still strong enough to destroy camera sensors and warp photographs. That is why Soviet authorities restricted access and kept images like this away from the public. The man in the photo is Artur Korneyev, one of the workers responsible for locating the most dangerous radioactive hotspots inside the reactor ruins. He approached the elephant's foot more times than anyone else, often without a full protective suit because equipment was limited. The fact that he is standing so close, calmly posing for a camera, makes the image even more unsettling. The elephant's foot looks like a sculpture, but it is a silent killer. It represents the exact moment when the reactor lost control and created something that should not exist. This is why the Soviet Union never wanted the world to see photos like this. It exposed the danger, the mismanagement, and the scale of the disaster that no propaganda could hide. Uncontaminated vegetables. Taken in May 1986, just weeks after the explosion, this photo showed a market stall filled with tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers. Above them hung a bold sign in German: "We offer you uncontaminated vegetables from our greenhouses." The message wasn't for locals. It was for foreign reporters and officials the government needed to reassure. People in the background walked through the market unaware that radioactive iodine-131 and cesium-137 were still settling across the region. Contamination was already in the soil, the water, and the air. Even greenhouse produce could carry danger, depending on how it was grown. None of this was shared with the public. What made the photo painful was the false sense of safety. Families bought vegetables believing they were protected. Officials knew they weren't. Chernobyl frogs. Chernobyl's environment has also led to bizarre adaptations of the eastern tree frog. These frogs have undergone shocking changes in this harsh and radioactive landscape, stressing the resilience of life in extreme conditions. Normally a vivid green, the eastern tree frogs found within the Chernobyl exclusion zone have a startlingly different appearance, with many individuals appearing pitch black. This difference in coloration is believed to be a result of rapid evolution in response to the high levels of radiation present in the area. Researchers have noted that the darker coloration in these frogs is linked to an increase in melanin, a pigment that serves a crucial purpose. Melanin not only provides camouflage, but also offers protective benefits against ultraviolet and ionizing radiation, reducing the likelihood of cellular damage. The presence of these darkly colored frogs suggests that those with higher melanin levels were evolutionarily favored in the aftermath of the nuclear disaster, as they were better equipped to survive the harsh conditions. The Swedish farmer in a radiation suit. Just weeks after the Chernobyl explosion, radiation reached farms hundreds of miles away. In rural Sweden, a farmer had to work his own fields wearing a full protective suit, gloves, and mask after his hay tested radioactive. This was not near the reactor site. It was more than 600 miles from Chernobyl. The fallout had crossed borders and spread across Europe in days, contaminating ordinary farmland without warning. Sweden had been the first country to realize something was wrong. Just 2 days after the explosion, radiation alarms at the Forsmark nuclear power plant went off, showing levels far too high to be local. When Swedish workers tested their shoes and clothing and found contamination, it became clear the source had come from the east. That discovery forced the Soviet Union to admit the accident publicly. Iodine-131, cesium-137, and strontium-90 had settled onto pastures, lakes, and forests. Milk, meat, reindeer, fish, mushrooms, and wild game were all affected. Some foods had to be pulled from stores. Safety checks became mandatory. Entire regions needed long-term monitoring. What made the photo so painful was its message. Chernobyl didn't stay in Ukraine. It hit people who had nothing to do with the reactor. People who woke up one morning to find radiation on their farms, in their fields, and in their food. It showed a world unprepared for a disaster that crossed borders as easily as wind. This was exactly why the image was kept out of Soviet reporting. The Blackbird of Chernobyl. In the years after the Chernobyl disaster, people began reporting sightings of a strange creature in and around the exclusion zone. It became known as the Blackbird of Chernobyl. Witnesses described a large, dark, bird-like figure with an unusually wide wingspan and glowing red eyes. Because of these features, many compared it to the Mothman, a creature from American folklore first reported in West Virginia during the 1960s. The Mothman was described in nearly the same way and became associated with disasters, most notably a deadly bridge collapse, earning it a reputation as a warning figure that appears before catastrophe. The Blackbird sightings usually happen near abandoned towns, forests, and power plant ruins. Those who claimed to see it said the creature did not behave like a normal bird. It was often silent, watched from a distance, and appeared suddenly before vanishing. Some witnesses believed its presence meant something bad was about to happen, which reinforced the comparison to the Mothman legend. Several reports claim that at least one photograph of the Blackbird was taken shortly after the disaster, but it was never released. During this period, the Soviet Union tightly controlled all media related to Chernobyl. Images that could cause panic, suggest mutations, or imply long-term consequences were routinely confiscated or classified. One explanation is psychological. After a massive tragedy, people living under fear, secrecy, and radiation exposure may interpret shadows, animals, or stress-induced hallucinations as something supernatural. Another explanation is biological. Some researchers suggest the Blackbird could be a real animal altered by radiation, such as a large owl or stork whose appearance was changed by environmental damage.